tracking. No worries. Oh, continue. Okay, continue. We use eye tracking, so we have special equipment for tracking people's gaze when they're doing computer-based tasks. Mouse tracking, tracking people's mouse movements as they're interacting with their computers, and that kind of reflects the cognitive dynamics of their decision-making process and their reasoning. We do discourse analysis that we quantify, so we record people talk in different tasks, and then we kind of analyze, those dialogues and get measurements out of what they say in terms of the number of words they use, the spatial expressions they use, and so on. What else we do? And then we use VR and AR technology. So these are kind of the general methods that we use, and I'll go through them in more detail in a bit. So our lab right now comprises the following set of people. The director or principal investigator, you may have heard the term PI, running the person in charge of the lab, although, we're actually, I don't consider us a very hierarchical lab. We're very egalitarian, and we engage not only in hierarchical mentoring with the PI mentoring the grad students and the undergrads, but also lateral mentoring. So maybe Marvin and Tevin, and I think we have our graduate student here, Maria, as well in our group. I think I saw her screen for a second, who can share that the students share knowledge with one another, and often they teach me things, right? So knowledge transmission goes in all directions, not just vertically, but also laterally too. So we have Tevin Williams, who's our master student and works as a GA, a graduate assistant in our lab. I've been at various places prior to coming to UMCC, so I have PhD student mentees at other institutions, and that includes Maria Furiu, who I think is here, and maybe she will be open to talking. I don't see everyone right now, but now with everything going virtual for a little bit, our remote students are able to join us very easily in our lab meetings through Zoom. So that's been kind of one of the benefits of this kind of transition to online interaction since March. And then our current research assistants include Marvin and Sierra Long as well. And then we have other affiliates of our lab who often join our lab meetings. They include CogSci certificate students at both the grad and undergrad levels. We have some post-baccalaureate volunteers in our lab, and some students who have served as CRS scholars, Charlotte Resource Scholars over the summer, and continue to be part of our lab this semester, just in part because a lot of our lab meetings have to do with professional development, and they benefit from being part of that and joining our group discussions when we talk about grad school applications and so on. Oh, I see stuff being drawn on my screen. I don't know if that's happening on your end too. No worries. Okay, so where are we? We are currently on Zoom primarily, but we do have physical spaces in Colbert. We have one big lab space, Colbert 3071, which is our main lab that we also in fact share with Dr. Markin's lab. So it includes kind of this open space that you see in this top left, top right picture that we can use for both meetings, for running experiments that require a lot of space, like our VR experiments and some of our experiments that involve the interaction of 2 or more individuals doing some kind of task. For example, Tevin is studying music improvisation, so we set up our instruments and our folks working in that space. So we have that big open space. You can actually see the music instruments, the cajons, here in the background. Okay. And then we have a conference room that you see here in the bottom right corner. We also have testing booths, so we can test participants individually. Dr. Markins often uses these booths for his own studies. And we also have a separate room in 3115, which is our eye tracking room. So I want to say a couple of things about our lab mission. Let me just make sure I'm keeping track of time. Okay. So with everything going on over the summer in particular, I wanted to reflect on what our mission was. So what is the point of doing research at this time, right? So on one hand, we're committed to science and we want to make scientific discoveries. And given the context of interest in our lab, we're interested in how we relate to others. So perspective taking is kind of at the core of much of our work, and hopefully by understanding how perspective taking works, we can figure out ways to improve perspective taking and promote mutual understanding among individuals. So that's kind of like a long-term agenda of our lab. We're also committed to open and transparent science. So we want to be creating and sharing knowledge broadly, transparently, and equitably. So in practice, what this means is that when we conduct a study, we are committed to sharing our data whenever possible and whenever we ensure that the privacy and confidentiality of our participants are protected. So sharing our data de-identified and anonymized with other researchers and the public, sharing our code so that others can replicate, reproduce, and confirm our findings, and sharing our materials. We also want to make our papers freely available to others. Often, you know, our papers are published in journals that are behind paywalls that libraries have to subscribe to and so on, and that makes the dissemination of science more difficult to the wider public. So we have ways of sharing our papers, for example, by posting them as preprints and putting them on our website so the public can access them more easily. And we have a commitment towards engaging in community outreach. And then the final point, which our lab is going to be reflecting on. So part of our agenda this semester is also to kind of work collectively on our lab mission and figure out, you know, how can we better scientists and better humans in a more inclusive lab, and so on. So we are committed to diversifying the voices that are contributing to the scientific enterprise in terms of broadening the pipeline of early career researchers. And that in part involves uncovering what I call the hidden curriculum. So how does academia work? How does research work? Right? How do you know how to find a lab? How do you approach a professor? How do you apply to grad school? So a lot of our mentoring that happens in our lab meetings focuses on that process of unveiling the hidden curriculum. So now I'll talk a little bit briefly about kind of the theoretical approach of the lab and the methods that we use, and then I'll let our students talk about their experience, and then I'll open the floor to everyone else. So I'll try to do this kind of quickly. So generally, the theoretical approach of our lab, you know, we study cognition, we study how the mind works, but we're a little different than a traditional cognitive experimental lab in that we're looking at cognition as being grounded in social interaction. Many of the studies, experimental studies of cognition, involve having one person in front of a computer doing some kind of task, pressing on computer keys. That's not our approach typically. We study cognition in the context in which it naturally occurs when people are interacting with one another. So this is reflected in our methods too. The second point is that we view cognition as a probabilistic and complex system. I won't say too much about that. Basically, our theoretical approach is grounded in dynamical systems theory and Bayesian models. This is kind of like how we kind of model cognition. We do a little bit of computational modeling too. And then the final piece that, again, is kind of relevant to our methods too, is that we view cognition as grounded in the body and the environment. So again, traditionally, cognitive science experiments, people pressing keys in front of a computer. Here we take the space and the body as being central to cognition. We view the body as influencing cognition. We will look at people's gestures a lot of the time. We look at how movement influences different aspects of reasoning, imagining different perspectives, and so on. And we care about the environment. And sometimes we manipulate the environment by having people be in a VR environment and systematically manipulating different aspects of the environment to see how that impacts their people's reasoning. So this is kind of like the overarching framework for what we do in the lab. And then I just want to highlight very quickly different types of methods. I kind of suggested some of them. I mentioned because we study kind of socially situated cognition, people often come to the lab in pairs, sometimes even in triads, right? And they do tests, however, that are fairly highly controlled. We don't usually prescribe what people say. And we sometimes might use a confederate, so an experimenter who acts like a participant, but typically we have two naive participants doing spontaneously some kind of constrained task. So for example, people might be telling a story to one another, it might be a controlled story, like a cartoon stimulus that they've watched and they're relating it. They might be giving directions to one another and so on. So we have this kind of task. We manipulate different things within the tasks and we see, what happens when people describe things. And so we might create this kind of transcripts and then code for different things in their behavior, how many words they use, the amount of egocentric or other centric expressions they use, and so on. We can do phonetic analyses, as you see here at the bottom. We can code people's gestures and so on. So we have these rich data sets of conversations that we analyze, and we end up with quantitative data that we do statistical analysis on. We also are interested in how people represent both their environment, but also the environments with their social partners in them, right? So we might have people memorize different arrays, and we might manipulate social things like, where is my partner to whom I am going to describe this array seated, right? And then we test people's memories in different ways. We might have them reproduce the array that they just saw on a grid. We might have them do kind of pointing tasks in an environment. So we might say, okay, this is the environment you experience. Imagine you're facing the church. Now point to the library or something like that. And we use data from the pointers to estimate their response time, their error that tells us something about their underlying mental representation, and so on. We also use eye tracking and mouse tracking in our study. So the idea is that people's eye movements indicate where they're attending to. So for example, if you look at this circle over here, this tabletop, let's say U represents the participant on this 2D display, and this represents their conversational partner, and their partner says, pick up the folder on the right, right? So that's ambiguous. I mean, the participant has to figure out whose right does my participant mean. This folder over here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, my mouse. This folder over here or the other one over here, right? So people's eye movements and their mouse movements, if they're responding with a mouse, can tell us what their reasoning is. For example, their mouse trajectories can reveal if they have any deliberation or not. This kind of mouse trajectories on the left indicate that this person makes an easy decision. They figure out what their perspective is and they go straight to it. Whereas the other one you see on the right is more circuitous. It means that they're deliberating, they're experiencing more competition from the two perspectives, right? So we have these dynamical measures of decision-making or reasoning that you can gather from people's mouse movements and their eye movements. And finally, we use VR and AR, again, as I mentioned, to manipulate space in ways that we cannot do in the real world. We can more easily do in VR. And examine different things like how do spatial features influence our reasoning, and how do people experience different types of environments. In this studies, again, with collaborators at the University of Cyprus, where our colleague Maria here is too, where we had people, we wanted to see whether people make different types of judgments when reasoning about a familiar environment, like their own dorm room, versus an unfamiliar environment. So we created this 3D photo scans of people's dorms rooms, and we either had participants who lived in that room make judgments about where objects were in their room, or someone else who didn't live in that dorm, who wasn't part of their room. So that allows us to compare reasoning about familiar and unfamiliar environments, again, leveraging the technology that we have in the lab using VR. So this is it on my end. Okay, we have a little bit of time, thankfully. Shall we have let me stop sharing my screen then. Would any of our students here like to share about their experience, and then I'm happy to answer questions. Marvin, for example, would you like to say a few things about your undergrad research experience?
Well, in general, picking the right lab for you is extremely important. If you are wanting to go to grad school, you're going to need research on your CV. And there are a lot of different personalities, and each of the labs are run very differently. And so you really need to find a fit with you that works for your personality and your goals. And what I have found in the Galati lab is a lot of support, a lot of openness. There's a lot of information. She's extremely organized. We meet weekly. There's always something that you're gaining from it. It's very active. And that's perfect for me. And there are other labs that are very hands-off. If you are a person who just really wants to focus on your thing, and you don't need outside help, you've got it all figured out, there are labs for that too. So, the other thing is that when you are establishing these relationships, you are going to be showing them who you are. So even if you're not going to be going to graduate school at UNCC, this is a person who probably knows like a lot of other people all through the nation. So this person can really help you figure out on the other end where you are going to go to grad school, if that person is a fit for you. So I would say take your time, but definitely get it done before your senior year, because it's like almost too late by then. Tevin?
Thank you, Marvin. Tevin, would you like to share a little bit about your experience in the lab and maybe your research too? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just kind of going off of what Marvin just said, one of the things that I find really helpful about this lab is, in addition to the research that we work on, we also work on like just kind of professional and academic development. So looking at things to open science practices and looking at pre-registering potential research projects, as well as like what exactly pre-registration means and why it's so important for having good scientific and producing good research. Also looking at not just focusing on trying to get significant results in everything that we do, but looking at how the research that we're developing and working on actually contributes, whether the results are significant or not, and why that's so important. And then also, like Dr. Galati mentioned earlier, just kind of focusing on trying to diversify and have an inclusive lab environment. I remember one time when we were looking at the virtual reality equipment, one of our lab members had some hair and the equipment wasn't able to cover it, and just looking at how things like that could be improved so that everyone feels included in the lab and is able to have a positive experience. And as it relates to my research and the skills that I've gained, I'm working on the eye coordination project and gaining the skills from everything from setting up the eye coordination equipment and having people come in and run studies, and then now going back and looking at coding the audio transcripts and trying to actually write down the audio that was recorded, and then looking at how we can code that so that we can gain information from those transcripts. So and in addition to that, also working on my thesis and trying to propose my thesis proposal so that I can start data collection on improving music improvisation using the instruments that you might have seen in Dr. Galati's picture. So there's a lot of opportunities to get hands-on research in different areas, and also thinking about diversity and just growing in academia as well.
Thank you, Tevin. Yeah, I think this has been like a year of true reflection, because even if we set out with the best intentions to be inclusive, we are in a system, right? And that means that sometimes even the equipment that we use in our lab, our EEG systems, our VR headsets, are excluding particular populations from being our participants, and that's a real problem, right? So that was like a real moment of like reflection in our lab, and we're like, okay, what do we need to do? We need to fix this. This is unacceptable, right? So this is part of the process of the lab of recognizing those limitations. The part that we're, implicitly participating in white supremacy, basically, and figuring out how to correct that to move forward. Maria, did you want to say a little bit about your engagement in our lab? This is Maria from the University of Cyprus.
Hello, everyone. You found me unprepared, Alexia.
Oh, no worries. You don't have to say anything. We can open the floor, but go ahead if you would like.
Yeah, so I am from the University of Cyprus. I'm a PhD student of psychology, and I am collaborating with Alexia for a grant that we took for my thesis, for my PhD thesis. So yeah, Alexia is very inclusive, is very supportive as a supervisor, and she really helped us for our personal and professional development. Personally, I'm collaborating with 3 labs. The lab that my supervisor has, Dr. Galati's lab, there, and Dr. Franco Pestilli lab, and each supervisor has something different to offer. But as students, I think that we need to be open and ready to adapt and learn as many things as we can from different people, because different professors have different experiences. But what I have really learned from Dr. Galati is like, she's very organized, and that helped me a lot in my research. She's doing an amazing job with data analysis. And she's very open in new methods, which is really good, because I think that the supervisors and the mentors need to be open in new methods and motivate their students to learn new things. So
thank you, Maria.
Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, even though my time becomes increasingly limited with every year, I'm always striving to keep on learning. I've never felt, oh, I'm a professor now, this is what I know, and this is what I'm going to keep doing. I'm always trying to keep up with what is best practices and keep on learning. And often in my lab, my students can confirm that I say, I don't know how to do this, let's figure this out, right? Like with Seven in particular, like we come across different tools, and I'm like, I don't know how to do this, let's Google it, let's look on Stack Exchange to figure out, you know, how do we solve this problem? So, you know, we're problem solvers, that's what scientists are.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really motivating for us that we're still students to be able to know that it's okay not to know everything. It's okay to do mistakes and stay motivated to learn more things and to troubleshooting.
And the skills that we're learning are, they're very now. You know, that's one thing I can say about the Galati lab is it's very now. We're learning R. You know, it's not SSPS, it's R, because that's where things are going. It's, you know, it's the OSPF network, because that's true science, where you're setting it up and you're creating your hypothesis before you gather the data. You know, it's the right steps. And that's the one thing that I'm learning in this, is what the right steps are and how you carry it out with the latest tools.
Exactly.
I know Dr. Carola has limited time, so I want to make sure that our students have the opportunity to ask some questions. And I'm happy to stick around a bit longer if you would like to answer questions.
Sure, thank you. Yes. Any questions from you all? We're getting lots of good information. Hopefully it's triggering good ideas and good fits and that sort of thing. Anything in particular that you would like to ask any of our guest presenters here? You all students?
What are some requirements that are needed to be eligible for the position of a research assistant?
Intellectual curiosity for the most part. I generally prefer that the students have taken RM2. That's kind of a soft requirement. But that being said, because I'm, as Marvin said, it's important I consider it important for students to be engaged in research early. That's both for your own benefit, if you are developing as a scholar and you have plans for graduate school, but also from your professor's perspective. We love having students around for multiple semesters and multiple years, right? It's savings for us to train someone and have them be part of our lab, become a more senior research assistant in our lab who can advise and mentor incoming research assistants. So we look for cultivating those relationships too. In general, I prefer having an RM2, the research method sequence completed. And I do have an application. Typically, that also involves writing samples that if we're working on papers together and or are ultimately going to be working on a thesis, I gauge where you are in terms of writing. But for me, intellectual curiosity and having intrinsic interest in what our lab studies or our lab values and methodological approach and commitment to open science are things that I'm kind of primarily looking for.
Great. And can you all see my screen a moment?
Yes.
Okay, great. With that, I just want to point out that on our Department of Psychology website, if you go to undergraduate programs, you're going to get all kinds of information. If you go through the menu, we have research assistantships. So it's technically a class that you would take. You can take it as often as you like. There are no limits to being in a lab only for a semester. As you were hearing, to a certain extent, the longer the better. And do take a look on here to kind of start your process in terms of thinking about some of the prerequisites, some of what the faculty are looking for. This is just kind of the big picture view. And then you would want to email the professors with whom you're particularly interested in working with, so you can ask for their particular applications or process for being a part of their lab. And our faculty can be found under the People tab. We have all our faces and contact information. Dr. Galati, I'm getting yours. Here we go. Colvard location, phone, email, and all of us have just a little bit of, at least a little bit of a blurb, and you have your research lab up on here with more information and places that you can look up what Dr. Galati is doing.
Yes, so you can find more information about my research on my website. And feel free to follow, if you have questions that we haven't had the time to address here today, feel free to email me and I'm happy to chat with you offline. Other questions or points?
I guess another point I could give you is definitely read the professor's research. Like before you contact them, before you say, hey, this is a lab that I want to be in, read the research, see if it interests you, see if their methodology, the theories that they're pursuing, know something about them and what they've done before you come to them.
Yes, that's an excellent, thoughtful tip. The, hey, can I be in your lab emails don't get you very far, I'm afraid. So I will exit out for now. And otherwise, if you all don't have any more questions, we'll probably end our session for today. Again, Dr. Galati is available to answer more questions or meet with you individually via email, Zoom, or however you can best reach Dr. Galati these days.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for your participation. See you in the next research lab.
See you then.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Galati.
No worries. Thank you.